So I'm very happy this evening to welcome Professor Brendan Smith from the University of Bristol. Brendan is Professor of Medieval History and he's published a number of books in that area and is still very active in research. Tonight his talk is Migration and Anglo-Irish Relations in the Middle Ages, which I'm sure we're all looking forward to, and I hope you'll be thinking of lots of questions till the end. Brendan, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm just trying to get to the opening slide. There we go, and see if I can bring that up on the screen to share with you. There we go. Now, can I get that full screen? All right. Well, thank you. Thank you to Professor Neil Wynne and the Gloucestershire branch of the Historical Association for the invitation to speak to you this evening. And my thanks to Andrea for, helping this happen and run so smoothly so far. And thank you all for, in a slight adaptation of the usual sort of words at this stage, thank you all for staying in on a dark Monday evening. I'll certainly have finished what I have to say by the time University Challenge comes on at 8:30. So if you need to dash off at that stage, I'll understand. Well, I'm sorry not to have the opportunity to visit Gloucester this evening and speak to you in person. Hopefully, we'll all be able to return to face-to-face delivery of papers such as this. I have to confess at the outset, the title of my paper isn't quite accurate. For instance, the Anglo in Anglo-Irish relations is anachronistic, since some of what I have to say concerns a period before England existed. A title that corresponded more closely with what I am going to talk about would have been something like Migration within, between and beyond Britain and Ireland in the Middle Ages. That's quite a mouthful. So I hope you'll bear with the slightly unsatisfactory title that I have provided. Migration has been a feature of human society everywhere on the planet throughout history, and is never far from the headlines in our modern world. Concern about migration, for instance, was a key factor in the most profound event in recent European politics, the withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the European Union. There's been an increased interest in the topic of migration in recent years among historians of various periods and geographical regions, not least because the topic is so ready. The topic so readily complements the growing scholarly field of global history. I just put a few recent book covers up there dealing with this, combination of migration, but seen from a sort of global perspective. This historical interest in migration, however, has had little impact on scholarship concerning today's experience of migration, where instead the views of social scientists and legal experts dominate. Because contemporary migration is usually associated with those whose departure from their homelands has been prompted by warfare, persecution, or poverty, and because public and political discourse often identifies migration as a problem, the tone of much modern migration scholarship coming out of the social sciences is defensive and advocatory. Above all, this scholarship seeks to challenge the suitability of the motif of, quote, the good refugee and the undeserving migrant. It seeks to challenge that as a guiding principle for how modern states should consider migration and its legal consequences. Now, this focus on the state and the legal system makes perfect sense when considering present-day migration. But is it helpful when considering migration in the medieval past? Well, we can start by saying that a discussion of migration in the Middle Ages, which fails to acknowledge that its nature and extent were influenced by how power was wielded by the political elite, would be deficient. The introduction of Jews to England by William I after 1066 and their expulsion by King Edward I in 1290 were both seen as impressive manifestations of the royal will. I hope you can see the manuscript illustration there, produced about half a century after the expulsion of the Jews, with the illustration at the bottom of a royal official, beating some Jewish people. You have achieved in one day what the pharaohs of ancient Egypt failed to do, marveled one chronicler of Edward I's removal of the Jews. I'm always struck by that comparison. I wonder, was it entirely complementary? I'm not sure how medieval kings, Christian kings, would have reacted to being compared with Pharaoh. Henry V's colonial venture in Normandy in the early 15th century was in a similar way regarded by contemporaries with a certain amount of awe. More generally, the temporary and permanent migration of civil servants and soldiers within the territories ruled by the English crown, stretching from Gascony to the Channel Islands, Wales, Ireland, and at times southern Scotland, and also in the early 15th century Normandy, the migration of English civil servants and soldiers within this huge region became a noticeable feature of English power in the late medieval period. But population movements, whether routine or sudden, whether within the borders of kingdoms or beyond, usually surpassed the capabilities of medieval government to control. Natural disasters, ranging from famine to the encroachment of the sea, prompted more geographic relocation than royal policy ever did, though England's wars against its neighbours also generated considerable migration. As Rhys Davies observed with reference to the political history of the medieval British Isles, quote, "Once our historical gaze could be shifted from the state and its institutions and from the seductive appeal of its prolific archives, other solidarities and collectivities could come more clearly into focus. Medieval migrants are inclined to appear before us in more sharply defined contours when distanced somewhat from the shadow of the state." So to put the state at the center of discussions of medieval migration seems unwise, as a starting point at least. Another point of contrast between present and past when thinking about migration is highlighted by Edward Said, who pondered what he called the, quote, "irremediably secular realities of modern migration." Spiritual enthusiasm was a major contributor to migration in and beyond the medieval British Isles, from the time of the conversion of the Irish, through the Irish and English missions to the continent. The movement of individuals and families to the Holy Land in the era of Crusades, the arrival in Britain and Ireland of monks and priests from northern France in the 2 centuries after 1066, the decision of some pilgrims to Rome throughout the period not to return to their homelands. It might not be too great an exaggeration to say that to a large extent, medieval migration was irremediably religious. The work of historians interested in distant periods can, of course, be enriched by the intellectual currents of the present, whether historians recognize their influence or not. In the context of migration, post-colonial perspectives are worth considering. From the 12th century to the 19th, England's migration story was one of emigration, the movement of English people to occupy lands beyond England's borders, which had previously belonged to others. An empire-wide census of 1901 concluded that 2,787,000, quote, natives of the United Kingdom were living in other parts of the British Empire. Post-colonial analysis has challenged the tendency to underplay the significance of this imperial reality on Britain itself. And this post-colonial analysis argues instead that the end of empire makes Britain, no less than its former dependencies, a post-colonial society. Is this of any relevance to the medieval situation? It's interesting to note that there has been more interest in migration into medieval England than migration from England elsewhere. The late Mark Ormrod's remarkable project, England's Immigrants, 1330 to 1550, and the publications arising from it, one of which I've put up on the slide there, these demonstrated clearly the extent to which late medieval England was open to migration from outside. In 1440, for instance, 1% of the population of England was of foreign origin, with the figure rising to 6% in London. It's interesting to note that those figures are pretty much the same as the information contained in the census of 1901. Turning back to late medieval England, some of the migration into the country that Ormrod's project picked up on was, I think we can say, post-colonial in character. It involved the arrival in England of descendants of English colonists established in previous centuries in Wales, Ireland, and Scotland. People who now felt their security threatened in these places and sought safety and better opportunities in England. And as English subjects, they were entitled to do so. In the early 1450s, this sort of trend of migration from the colonies, if you like, was added to by English settlers from Normandy, who, in the face of a victorious French army, abandoned the settlements established there in Normandy a generation before. The return of colonists from parts of its medieval empire caused resentment in sections of English society. And the outbreak of the long period of civil war we know as the Wars of the Roses in 1453 was related to some extent to not only the loss of Normandy, but the return to England of Norman settlers. The need for historians of medieval migration to pay attention to current thinking on aspects of the topic is highlighted when we turn to the issue of slavery. Until the 12th century, slavery was a major contributor to population movement in Britain and Ireland, and from Britain and Ireland elsewhere. And an analysis of migration in the period that excluded slavery from consideration would be seriously deficient. I always shudder when I see this object in the National Museum in Dublin. It's sort of so fragile looking, isn't it? But think of the horror it represents. Well, to make the point that I'm including slavery in a study of migration would barely seem worthy of remark, were it not for a recent controversy in the United States, of which you may be aware. In March 2017, the newly appointed Secretary for Housing and Urban Development in the United States, an African-American former neurosurgeon named Ben Carson, he made a speech in which he mused about what made America great. The context was an exhibition of photographs he had seen recently of some of those who had arrived at Ellis Island in New York from Europe in the late 19th century. And he walked around the stage. You can see this on YouTube, and he spoke without a script. And he said, and I quote, "They worked." He's talking about these European migrants who arrived in Ellis Island. "They worked not for themselves, but for their sons and daughters, their grandsons and granddaughters, that they might have an opportunity in this land." That's what America is about, a land of dreams and opportunities. He probably wished subsequently that he'd stopped there, but instead he went on with what I've put on the screen. There were other immigrants who came in the bottom of slave ships, etc. Uproar ensued. It's easy to see why Carson's remarks provoked such strong feelings. To the extent that the American story or myth with regard to migration is a story of the land of the free, providing refuge and opportunity to the poor, tired, huddled masses, then that story or myth cannot convincingly be said to include those who arrived in America as slaves. Almost immediately after his speech had finished, a government spokesman came out to defend Carson, saying, quote, "Nobody here believes he was equating voluntary immigration with involuntary servitude." Initially, Carson stuck to his guns. Interviewed immediately after his speech or soon after on a radio show, he said, "I think people need to actually look up the word immigrants, whether you're voluntary or involuntary. If you come from the outside to the inside, you're an immigrant. Slaves came here as involuntary immigrants, but they still had the strength to hold on." Well, that didn't calm the storm at all, and the inevitable groveling retraction soon followed. And here it is. The slave narrative and the immigrant narrative are two entirely different experiences. You read both of these paragraphs and you see if you can reconcile them. I can't. Slaves were ripped from their families, forced against their will after being sold into slavery. The immigrants made the choice to come to America. They saw the country as a land of opportunity. In contrast, slaves were forced here against their will and lost all their opportunities. And he went on. We continue to live with that legacy. The two experiences should never be intertwined. nor forgotten, as we demand the necessary progress towards an America that's inclusive and provides access to equal opportunity for all. The headline about the original Carson speech in The Guardian on the 6th of March 2017 read, "Ben Carson incorrectly suggests African slaves were immigrants to the US." And it contained reporter Jamila's Larte's observation, quote, "Enslaved Africans were, of course, not immigrants." The fact that Lartey didn't feel the need to justify this statement suggests that the belief that slavery should not be considered as a form of migration is widely shared in some modern circles. While I would defend including the experience of slaves in my analysis of migration in the medieval British Isles, the Carson episode does serve as a timely reminder that voluntary and forced migration need to be distinguished in all ages. Choice is the key word. It's entirely appropriate that a recent excellent collection of essays on medieval migration, entitled Freedom of Movement in the Middle Ages, does not touch on slavery. In like manner, to look at the other side, a book on medieval slavery would be unlikely to mention pilgrimage or the establishment of merchant communities overseas. So in other words, we mustn't confuse freedom of movement with all forms of migration. Freedom of movement does not cover all forms of migration, and particularly, obviously, doesn't cover slavery. Migration as a result of enslavement, in other words, has no place within the traditional migration rubric of push and pull factors. And I think we need to move away from thinking of migration in that, for that binary approach, push and pull, when we think about migration, certainly in the Middle Ages. More fitting, I think, is a model of migration that on one axis ranges from the voluntary to the involuntary, and on the other covers the host of economic, political, and personal considerations that might prompt relocation. And I think for most people who migrated, it's a combination of, somewhere along the axis from voluntary to involuntary on the one hand, and then other factors relating to their economic or political or personal circumstances on the other, that they combine to prompt migration. With all this in mind, we turn to the realities of migration in the context of medieval Britain and Ireland, and are immediately confronted by an individual, St. Patrick, whose experience of migration confounds much of our thinking on the topic. Here we have him, Patrick, in one of the earliest stories about him, evangelizing an Irish pagan king, accidentally spearing the king's foot with his staff. The king just sits there and sort of winces, believing that having his foot pierced is part of the sort of evangelization process. Patrick, who probably flourished in the second half of the 5th century, has left us with the earliest account in Western literature of slavery, written by one who experienced its horrors. Patrick was a member of a Romano-British family, and he was 15 or thereabouts when he was abducted by Irish slave raiders from the estates of his Romano-British family. And these estates were probably located on the southern side of the Bristol Channel, not far from the sea. Somewhere around Banwell, I would think, or Salford. Patrick spent 6 years as a slave in Ireland, living near Killala Bay on Mayo's Atlantic coast, where he was deployed to herd livestock. When he returned later to pursue his missionary activities, he spent his time probably in the South Ulster region around Armagh and Downpatrick. What Patrick provides us with in his writings is a template for identifying the key features of slavery in Britain and Ireland in his lifetime, and for understanding the links between it and migration that holds good into the 12th century. His writings tell us that slave raids were designed to capture large numbers of people. They were big-scale operations. That the Irish raided for slaves among the Britons, and that the Britons did the same among the Irish. That Christians enslaved other Christians, that Christian slaves were sold on to pagans, such as the Picts, that male slaves were deployed as agricultural laborers, that female slaves, that females were a particular target of slave raids and were used for domestic, including sexual purposes. If Patrick wrote in the second half of the 5th century, then his compositions coincide with the arrival in Britain of large numbers of German-speaking settlers from Saxony and adjacent regions. As Anglo-Saxon kingdoms began to emerge in the early 6th century, it is clear that warfare among them and against the British or Britons also involved the taking and selling on of slaves. And it is also clear that many of these slaves were sold abroad. Writing in the early 8th century, Bede famously reported the encounter at the slave market of Rome at the end of the 6th century between Pope Gregory and a group of child slaves from Britain, Anglian child slaves, of course, which led to the Roman mission under Augustine to evangelize the Anglo-Saxons. We know from a separate account that in September 595, Gregory ordered one of his priests to purchase pueri Angli, Anglian youths, who were for sale in southern Gaul. The peoples of the British Isles, in short, engaged in slavery before the arrival of the Vikings at the end of the 8th century. Thereafter, however, the number of slaves forced to migrate against their will increased significantly. Slaves represented what one historian has called the startup capital that allowed Scandinavian factions that had lost out in domestic power struggles to engage in the international trade that would provide them with the luxury goods and high-quality weapons that they craved. Slaves from Britain and Ireland were bought and sold at markets at Hedeby in Denmark and Gothenburg in Sweden, while further south, Christian rulers made use of Jewish and Frisian traders who dealt with the Vikings in order to stock the markets at Venice and at Rouen, which provided slaves to Al-Andalus and North Africa. The demand for the unpaid labor that slaves provided from Iceland and Scandinavia in the north to the Spanish Caliphate, Italy and Byzantium in the south was so large that the slave trade may even have kick-started economic activity in the West after centuries of stagnation. Michael McCormack has argued that, quote, in some not unimportant measure, Europe financed the early growth of its commercial economy by selling Europeans as slaves to the Arab world. The sale of young Europeans on the shores of Africa, in the markets of Spain and the Middle East, helped fuel the nascent economy of Europe. End quote. Within the British Isles, slavery probably peaked in the 11th century, with active markets engaged in the export of slaves located at Dublin and Bristol. It's probable that a majority of the 50,000 to 70,000 slaves present in 12th century Norway had some Irish ancestry, while in Iceland, Irish women and their offspring accounted for a large proportion of the 4,000 to 5,000 slaves who supported the island's population of about 20,000. In Scandinavia and the Muslim world, domestic workers were more sought after than agricultural labourers, and young women were often the targets of slave raids and the preferred purchases of slave buyers in the markets, which I've mentioned already. A hostile account of the career of Geitha, the Danish wife of Earl Godwin of Wessex, and the mother of King Harold, or Harold the Usurper. A hostile account of her life written in the early 12th century, about half a century after her own death in 1068, asserted that Geitha specialized in the export of young English girls and pregnant women as slaves to Denmark. The Vita Wulfstani, written to commemorate the life of Wulfstan, Bishop of Worcester, who died in 1095. This Wulfstan, of course, who attempted to close down the slave market in Bristol. His life, or his biography, contained the observation that, quote, you might well groan to see the long rows of young men and maidens whose beauty and youth might move the pity of the savage, bound together with cords and brought to market to be sold. So enslavement dragged people around and moved people from their home to different areas. The fear of enslavement also drove migration. A majority of the 3,000 captives, the number is probably exaggerated, but it stands for a large number. A majority of those captives taken by the Vikings from Kells in County Meath in Eastern Ireland in 951 were probably peasants who had already moved, who had moved to Kells from the surrounding countryside in search of safety from earlier attacks. Following a Viking raid on Anglesey in 987, which resulted in 2,000 of its inhabitants being led away as captives, the King of Gwynedd and Deheubarth, the leading Welsh ruler of his time, resettled the survivors, those who remained on Anglesey, in Ceredigion and Difford, and subsequently ransomed some of those who had been taken from the island. On a smaller scale, important monastic communities in various parts of the British Isles and in Francia, such as those at Iona and Lindisfarne, fled to new and safer locations, or else simply dispersed. But when they fled, they took with them the precious relics of their founders. Migration, in other words, was a matter not only for the living. Here we have a reliquary, which was found in Scandinavia. No doubt the bones of the saint contained in the reliquary were simply shaken out onto the ground by the Vikings who plundered this object, but they took it back with them because of its worth. So these relics, they consisted of some of the human remains of men who in the late 6th and early 7th centuries had left their native Ireland to evangelize the pagan peoples of Britain. In choosing to behave in this way, men such as Columba, who went to Iona, Aidan, associated of course with Lindisfarne, Northumberland, these men followed a course of action which St. Patrick had taken, in the reverse direction of course, in the middle of the 5th century. Patrick's experience of migration involved not only enslavement, transportation to Ireland and escape back to his home, but also later in his life, his permanent voluntary return to Ireland in the cause of religion. This sounds weird to us, and it was also weird to Patrick himself. His writings reveal that the separation from his family and native place that his evangelizing mission to Ireland demanded from him pained him deeply, and could only be understood by him as lying at the heart of his vocation. Can it be that I came to Ireland without God? Who compelled me? I'm bound by the spirit that I should not see anyone from my kindred. I've returned to that Gentile people who once captured me and ravaged the slaves and handmaids of my father's house. At the last, I am a slave in Christ for that remote Gentile people. A passage, I think, very influenced by Patrick's reading of St. Paul, perhaps particularly the letter to the Romans. The phrase, a slave in Christ for that remote Gentile people, blurs in a remarkable way the apparently unbridgeable divide we saw earlier between voluntary migration and involuntary servitude. To do God's will, Patrick believed, it was necessary that he live as an exile and a stranger in a foreign land. And he found consolation in the belief that to, quote, lose fatherland and parents, unquote, had enabled him to receive, and I quote again, a gift so great, so salutary as God's approval. Migration for the love of God, seen as both a source of distress and of spiritual fulfillment, proved attractive to many Christians in Ireland and Britain. An Irish homily of the 7th century identified it as a form of martyrdom. Violent death in the service of God, so-called red martyrdom, was the ultimate expression of self-sacrifice. White martyrdom, while of lesser merit, was still commendable. According to the homilist, quote, white martyrdom is when someone parts for the sake of God from everything that they love, so that they may suffer fasting and hard work. White martyrdom was a very, it was a very common experience, a very common form of migration in the early medieval period in Britain and Ireland. Many Anglo-Saxon men came to Ireland as religious exiles. And again, many women and men from Britain and Ireland traveled to the continent to evangelize German-speaking peasants from Frisia to Bavaria, with some of these men, such as Boniface of Mainz and Kilian of Würzburg, suffering martyrdom for their efforts. The tradition of clergy leaving Britain and Ireland for the continent was maintained and strengthened into the 9th century as Charlemagne and his successors sought to promote learning in their empire. So prominent were Irish scholars as educationalists that it inspired resentment among native churchmen in Francia. And further, when the Bavarian theologian and poet Walafrid of Strabo, who died in 849, remarked that travel had become almost second nature to the Irish, He did not intend it as a compliment. Even more blunt was the theologian Heinrich of Auxerre, who in the 860s complained that, quote, almost the whole of Ireland, setting the obstacle of the sea at naught, is migrating to our shores, like a herd of philosophers. Were there any Irishmen left in Ireland? He wondered sarcastically. English and Irish clergy on the continent were deeply involved in the movement of monastic reform that gathered pace in France and Germany from the 10th century. Since the conversion period of the late 6th and 7th centuries, English kings had welcomed foreign churchmen. And this tradition was reinforced in the late 9th century when King Alfred invited scholars from the continent to England to help further his educational agenda. In the middle of the 10th century, St. Dunstan drew upon his time at the monastery of St. Peter at Ghent to inform his programme for the reform of Benedictine monasticism in England. And he called upon other English monks who had been trained in reformed monasteries in France and Germany to return to England to support his efforts. On the eve of the Norman conquest, not only did King Edward the Confessor choose the Norman Robert of Jumièges to be Archbishop of Canterbury in 1051, Harold, son of Godwin, also selected the Lotharingian scholar Adelard of Liège to lead his favoured religious house of Waltham, Holy Cross Abbey, which he refounded in the late 1050s. With the Norman conquest, many more French-speaking clergy arrived in England, and within a generation or two, the upper ranks of the diocesan and monastic establishments of southern Britain were dominated by foreign-born clerics in a manner that had not been seen since the 7th century. We may cite the arrival of the first Dominicans at Oxford in 1221, the 800th anniversary of which was marked earlier this summer, as a late example of the process by which the English Church participated fully in a wider Western experience of religious reform, which involved the migration of usually French-speaking clergy. English clergy, of course, moved in the opposite direction. Nicholas Breakspere became Pope, Adrian IV. John of Salisbury held a French diocese as bishop, and Stephen of Lexington became head of the Cistercians, the most important monastic order of the time. The Norman conquest brought not only religious migrants, but also nobles, town dwellers, artisans, and peasants to England. This was the latest in a series of episodes of migration involving Britain that, for the purposes of this paper, can be said to have begun in the 5th century. From the 5th to the 8th century, Britons relocated from the south and west of the country to the old Roman province of Armorica in northwest France. Already by the late 6th century, the western part of the province was being referred to by contemporaries as Britannia. We know it, of course, as Brittany, and it was by then a region ruled by British speakers, which was culturally and politically distinct from Frankish Gaul. In the same period, the 5th to the 8th century, parts of Western Britain from Cornwall to the Hebrides were settled by people from Ireland, with Dyfed and Gwynedd in Wales and Argyll in Scotland witnessing the most substantial migrations. To the east, German-speaking migrants established themselves from the early 5th century, and by the end of the 8th century, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms extended from the borders of Cornwall and Highland Wales as far north as Edinburgh. From the middle of the 9th century, Scandinavian settlements were established in coastal locations in Ireland, in northern and western Scotland and its islands, in the Isle of Man, and of course, in large swathes of eastern England, with the final tranche of Danish settlers arriving in eastern England as late as the early 11th century. It's impossible to quantify the numbers involved in these various migrations. Historians have called upon the disciplines of archaeology, place name study, linguistics, genetics, in their efforts to gain some sense of the scale of population movement, but with limited results. Earlier ideas of large-scale folk migration and the total elimination, enslavement, or expulsion of previous occupiers of the land have been discredited, with the emphasis of scholarship moving instead towards examination of how and why existing majority population groups came to adopt the language and customs of minority migrant communities which settled among them. An obvious example of this phenomenon is the complete disappearance of Pictish culture and language in the north of Britain, as the majority Pictish population chose Scandinavian or Gaelic identities in the course of the 9th century. Another example is summed up nicely by Thomas Charles Edwards, who has observed the English had been outstandingly successful in imposing an English culture throughout their territories, both where Germanic immigrants were numerous and where they were rare. The fact that the majority of inhabitants of Anglo-Saxon England were of Romano-British origin, just as the majority of inhabitants of Alba, or the Kingdom of the Scots, were of Pictish origin, strongly suggests that the real power of migration lies not in numbers, but in cultural influence. The reality that migration was more than a numbers game is underscored by the course of migration to Britain and Ireland in the wake of the Norman conquest of England. The number of migrants involved from northern France was not great and amounted to only a very small percentage of the population as a whole. At the level of the nobility, however, the native element was almost entirely replaced by newcomers. Below the elite level, distinct Breton and Flemish groups, as well as those from Normandy, were among those who settled both in the towns and in the countryside. And collectively, they were known as Francigena, those born in France. Within a couple of generations at the level of the peasantry and the town dwellers, no distinction could be made between them and their neighbours. Everyone spoke English, but at the same time, everyone stopped giving English names to their children, choosing French names instead. From the early 12th century, all subjects of the crown were simply labelled Anglais in the French writings, which predominated in the country as English declined as a written form of communication. Very soon after 1066, the power of the English crown began to be felt with new intensity in other parts of Britain. The advance into Wales was accompanied by the appointment of French-speaking bishops and the introduction of colonists, both English and continental. A resilient Flemish migrant community was established in Pembrokeshire. In the north, Carlisle and its region was taken from the King of Scots, and again settlers from further south were introduced, and eventually a new bishopric of Carlisle established. There had always been some link between the extension of political authority and the migration of members of the dominant group to lands newly won. But with the castle as a new focus of authority, this was now much more obvious. The attractiveness of the development was demonstrated by the enthusiasm shown by Scottish kings from the early 12th century, well into the 13th, to recruit members of French-speaking aristocratic families from England and sometimes Normandy, families with names such as Bruce and Balliol, and to recruit also peasants and townsfolk for the new urban centres that the Scottish monarchy sponsored. It was no surprise that the conquest of Ireland was accompanied by migration. Unlike Britain, Ireland had experienced no large-scale foreign settlement in historic times, though Viking settlement in the hinterlands of the coastal towns they controlled was indeed a fact. As had happened in Britain, this migration had ecclesiastical and secular dimensions. By the 1220s, Irish lords had been replaced in East Ulster and large parts of Leinster and Munster, and new towns and manors were peopled with English and Welsh migrants. In the countryside, Irish cultivators remained, but with a status equivalent to that of villeins or unfree tenants in England. In the 1230s and 1240s, another colonial drive this time using personnel already present on the island, saw the establishment of new English settlements in Connacht in the far west of Ireland. The late 13th century saw the final conquest of Wales and the establishment of more English colonial settlements around newly constructed castles in the north and northwest of the country. It's clear that a great number of people in England were on the move in these centuries. Rhys Davies has called it, quote, the second wave of Anglo-Saxon migration. The English crown and the great lords to whom it made large grants worked together to encourage migration and sometimes competed with each other to attract individuals or groups to relocate to their newly established settlements. Many of those who moved to Ireland or Wales were already people of substance, and some quite modest families managed to retain landholding interests for several generations that crossed the Severn or the Irish Sea. Even for these families, but more particularly for those below them on the social scale, migration offered more land, fewer labour services, and higher status. In terms, for instance, of opportunities for office holding, such as sheriff. As pressure on land in parts of England grew from the late 12th century and throughout the 13th, so too did incentives to migrate to Ireland. The attempt to conquer Scotland after 1296 involved projects to establish new English colonies that were not finally abandoned until the 1330s. It might be expected that the decline in population that began with the famine of 1315 to 18 and gathered frightening pace after the appearance of plague in the British Isles in 1348, it might be imagined that this put an end to colonial migration schemes. But this was not the case. The capture of Calais in 1347 was followed by a recruitment campaign aimed especially at the inhabitants of Kent and Essex to fulfill Edward III's commitment to populate the town with his English subjects. And this recruitment campaign continued with some success, even after the first onslaught of plague in 1348-49. From the middle of the 14th century, successive chief governors of Ireland promised the crown, the English king, in their indentures that they would populate lands recovered from the king's Irish enemies with settlers brought over from England, although that never actually happened. But following the conquest of Normandy in 1417, Henry V instigated a major migratory movement across the Channel in a period when the demographic collapse caused by endemic plague was at its most obvious. It's no surprise that migration between the islands of Britain and Ireland was common in the 1,000 years or so I've discussed this evening. Parts of the neighbouring islands are visible with the naked eye from the other side. And in favourable sailing conditions, the expectation was in the Middle Ages that the Irish Sea could be crossed in half a day. Relocation in this period took numerous forms, the most notable of which were the forced movement of slaves, the voluntary exile of missionaries, and the colonization of territories across the water. The 12th century was an important period as it saw both the end of slavery-related relocation and an unprecedented level of migration by English people to other parts of Britain and to Ireland. The 14th century witnessed another change in the pattern of migration, with most relocation occurring from west to east across the Irish Sea rather than east to west, as had been the case since the 12th century. All classes of society were involved in all episodes of migration, though our sources focus on the experience of the elites. The link between population levels and migration is far from straightforward. Both in periods of high population and periods of sharp demographic decline, migration persisted. So to conclude, migration changed the lives of those who relocated, and also the lives of those who remained behind, and finally the lives of those among whom migrants settled. It was, as one modern observer has put it, quote, a total social fact. Appreciating its importance and recognizing its rhythms, I suggest, can help advance our understanding of medieval Anglo-Irish relations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brendan. That was absolutely fascinating. I'll just turn off the recording and then we'll start on a few questions.
I could see one there from Ian.